Picture this. You're standing in a laboratory in San Diego, California. In your hands, you're holding a mastodon femur, a massive leg bone from an elephant-like creature that went extinct thousands of years ago, but this isn't just any fossil. This bone is shattered in a very specific way. Spiral fractures, impact marks. The unmistakable signature of something, or someone, deliberately smashing it open while it was still fresh, still full of marrow. Your hands start to shake, because the dating results just came back. This bone, it's 130,000 years old. Let me say that again. 130,000 years. According to every textbook, every archaeological timeline, every scientific consensus, that's impossible. Humans weren't supposed to be in the Americas until maybe 15,000 years ago. 20,000 if we're being generous. But 130,000. That's not just wrong, that's insane. So who broke this bone? Who extracted the marrow? Who used rocks as hammers and anvils at a time when the Americas were supposed to be completely, utterly, pristinely empty of anything resembling a human being? Here's where it gets wild. It couldn't have been us. Homo sapiens, our species was just barely getting started in Africa 130,000 years ago. We weren't roaming the globe yet. We hadn't left home. We definitely weren't in California cracking open mastodon bones for a midnight snack, but someone was, or something was. What if I told you there was another human species, not us, but something close, that had the skills to pull this off? A species that mastered fire 1,000,000 years ago. That created sophisticated stone tools, that crossed open oceans to reach remote islands, that survived and thrived for nearly 2,000,000 years across Africa, Asia, and Europe. Homo erectus, our ancient cousin, the most successful human species that ever lived, if we're measuring success by sheer longevity. They walked upright, they used tools, they cooked their food. They cared for their sick and elderly. And they went everywhere. But did they go there? Did they somehow impossibly cross into the Americas 100,000 years before we did? The scientific world exploded when this evidence was published. Teams formed, battle lines were drawn. Careers were staked on proving or disproving this single explosive claim. Because if it's true, if Homo erectus really did reach the New World, then everything we thought we knew about human migration, about who got where and when, about the entire peopling of the planet. It's wrong, and here's the thing that keeps me up at night. The evidence is there, broken bones, suspicious rocks, dating that keeps coming back the same. But it's just ambiguous enough, just controversial enough that we can't be sure. We're stuck in this maddening space between possibility and proof. So join me as we dive into one of the most controversial mysteries in all of archaeology. We're going to examine the evidence, meet the skeptics, explore whether Homo erectus even could have made such a journey, and confront a question that challenges everything we think we know about human history, because if they made it, what happened to them? And what does it mean to be the second humans to discover America? Let's find out. Let's rewind to 1992, Southern California. A routine highway expansion project near San Diego. Construction crews are doing what construction crews do, moving earth, laying foundations, making progress. And then someone notices something odd in the dirt. Bones, really big bones. The kind that make you stop the bulldozers and call in the experts. Enter the paleontologists. What they found was spectacular. The nearly complete skeleton of a Columbian mastodon, an elephant-like creature that roamed the Americas during the Ice Age. Mastodons were magnificent beasts, standing up to 10 feet tall, with curved tusks that could span 8 feet. Finding one this complete, that's a paleontologist's dream. They carefully excavated the site, documented everything, and then the bones went into storage for decades. Because here's the thing about science, sometimes you find something so important, so potentially revolutionary, that you need years to properly analyze it. You need the right technology, the right team, the right moment. And in 2017, that moment arrived. A team led by Stephen Holland published a paper in the journal Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals on the planet. Their claim: this wasn't just a mastodon fossil, this was a crime scene, and the crime happened 130,000 years ago. Now, before we go further, let's talk about why that number, 130,000, is absolutely explosive. According to the mainstream scientific consensus, humans first arrived in the Americas somewhere between 13,000 and 15,000 years ago. Maybe, if we're being generous and accepting some of the more controversial pre-Clovis sites, we can push that back to 20,000 or even 30,000 years. But 130,000, that's not just pushing the envelope. That's setting the envelope on fire and throwing it off a cliff. So what did Holland and his team actually find? Let's break it down like the forensic investigation it became. First, there were the bones themselves, specifically the way they were broken. These weren't clean breaks from natural weathering or from the weight of sediment pressing down over millennia. These were what's called spiral fractures, the kind of breaks you get when bone is still fresh, still full of moisture and collagen. Smash a dry bone and it shatters. Smash a fresh bone and it splinters, spirals, breaks in distinctive patterns, and that's exactly what they saw. Femurs cracked open in ways that suggested deliberate forceful impact. Ribs fractured at odd angles. The researchers argued these were the telltale signs of something deliberately breaking these bones. But why would anyone do that? Simple: marrow. That fatty, nutrient-rich tissue inside long bones was like prehistoric gold. High in calories, high in fat, and if you're an early human or hominin trying to survive in a new landscape, you take every calorie you can get, but broken bones alone don't make a case. After all, lots of things can break bones. Scavengers, geological pressure, even other mastodons trampling the remains. So the researchers looked for more evidence, and they found it: stones. Large cobble-sized stones that appeared to have been used as hammers and anvils. One stone in particular caught their attention. It showed clear signs of battering, with impact marks and chipping consistent with being used to smash bone. Another large stone was positioned directly beneath one of the broken femurs, perfectly placed to serve as an anvil while someone hammered from above. The team conducted experiments, replicating the process with modern elephant bones and similar stones. The fracture patterns matched. The positioning made sense. Everything pointed to one conclusion. Someone with enough intelligence and purpose had butchered this mastodon, extracting the marrow with stone tools in a systematic, deliberate manner. And when they dated the site using multiple methods, including uranium-thorium dating of the bones themselves, the numbers kept coming back the same. 130,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years. Let me put this in perspective. 130,000 years ago, Neanderthals were hanging out in Europe. Denisovans were doing their thing in Asia. And our own species, Homo sapiens, was just getting started in Africa. We're talking early archaic forms, not the globe-trotting modern humans who would eventually spread to every corner of the planet, the Americas. They were supposed to be empty, pristine, untouched by anything with a brain capable of cracking open bones for marrow. The implications were staggering. If someone was butchering mastodons in California 130,000 years ago, it couldn't have been Homo sapiens. We hadn't even left Africa yet, at least not in any numbers. So who was it? The researchers danced around the question, but the most logical candidate was staring everyone in the face: Homo erectus. Erectus, our ancient cousin. The hominin that stood upright, mastered fire, created sophisticated stone tools, and spread from Africa across Asia and into Europe over the course of nearly 2 million years. They were survivors, adapters, pioneers, and if anyone had the skills and the audacity to reach the Americas long before we did, it would be them. But of course, this is science, and extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and oh, did the skeptics come out swinging. When the Cerutti Mastodon paper dropped in 2017, it didn't just make waves, it triggered a tsunami. Social media lit up. News outlets ran headlines like "Humans in America 115,000 years earlier than thought." Academic Twitter became a battleground, and the scientific community. Let's just say not everyone was ready to pop the champagne. The criticism came fast and fierce, and it came from multiple angles. Let's start with the most obvious one: where are the tools? If hominins were butchering mastodons, they needed tools, stone tools, sharp flakes, hand axes, choppers, something more than just a couple of beat-up cobblestones. The Cerutti site had hammerstones and anvils, sure, but where were the actual cutting implements? Where were the flakes that would have been struck off during tool-making? Where was the distinctive debitage, the waste chips and fragments that always accumulate when someone's working stone? Critics pointed out that the absence of clear, unambiguous stone tools was a massive red flag. After all, Homo erectus made tools, lots of tools. Acheulean hand axes, cleavers, sophisticated bifacial implements. If Erectus had been at this site, there should be tools scattered around like breadcrumbs. Instead, there were just these cobbles that might have been used as hammers. Then there was the geological argument. Some researchers suggested that natural processes could explain everything the Cerutti team attributed to human activity. Heavy rocks tumbling in streams can break bones. Geological pressure over thousands of years can create fracture patterns. Maybe a mastodon died near a creek, and natural processes, erosion, sediment movement, the weight of overlying rock, created the appearance of intentional breakage. No humans required. One particularly vocal critic published a detailed rebuttal examining the fracture patterns. He argued that without clear impact notches, without definitive proof that force was applied while the bone was fresh, you couldn't rule out natural breakage. Yes, the fractures looked spiral-ish. But were they really the distinctive spiral fractures you see in controlled experiments? Or were researchers seeing what they wanted to see? And then there's the argument that really cuts to the bone. If Homo erectus made it to the Americas 130,000 years ago, where are they? Where are the fossils? Where are the footprints? Where are the campsites, the hearths, the accumulations of tools and food debris that should be scattered across the landscape? You can't have a population of hominins living in the Americas for tens of thousands of years without leaving more than one ambiguous mastodon site. The critics had a point. Archaeology is full of sites where human activity is unambiguous. You see layers of occupation, fire pits with charcoal, stone tools by the thousands, cut marks on dozens of bones. A single site with a handful of broken bones and some suspicious rocks. That's not enough to rewrite the entire history of human migration. But here's where things get interesting. Holin and his team didn't back down. They responded to the critiques methodically. On the question of tools, they pointed out that not all butchery sites have cutting tools. Sometimes you're just extracting marrow, and all you need are hammerstones. The absence of flakes doesn't mean the absence of humans. It might just mean the site wasn't a tool-making location. On the geological arguments, they brought in experts in taphonomy, the study of how organisms decay and fossilize. These experts examined the fracture patterns under microscopes, compared them to known examples of both natural and human-caused breakage, and concluded that the Cerutti breaks were more consistent with intentional percussion than with geological processes, and they ran more experiments. They took fresh elephant bones and subjected them to all kinds of natural processes: trampling, tumbling in water, burial under sediment. None of it produced the exact pattern of breakage seen at Cerutti. But when they deliberately smashed the bones with rocks, positioning them on stone anvils, perfect match. Still, the skeptics weren't convinced, and honestly, that's how science is supposed to work. Extraordinary claims face extraordinary scrutiny. the burden of proof is high, and it should be. Because if we're going to rewrite textbooks, if we're going to fundamentally change our understanding of when and how the Americas were peopled, we'd better be absolutely certain. But here's what's fascinating. The Cerutti site isn't alone. It's just the most dramatic, the most controversial, the most in-your-face example. There are other sites scattered across the Americas that hint at a much earlier human presence. The Topper site in South Carolina, with possible artifacts dating back 50,000 years. The Pedra Furada cave paintings in Brazil, which some researchers claim are over 30,000 years old. The Bluefish caves in Canada, with cut-marked bones that might be 24,000 years old. None of these sites are universally accepted. All of them are controversial. But together they form a pattern, a whisper of possibility that maybe, just maybe, the story we've been telling about the Americas isn't complete. Let's play a game. Let's assume, just for a moment, that the Cerutti team is right. That 130,000 years ago, some hominin species, probably Homo erectus, was living in California, hunting or scavenging mastodons, making tools, and trying to survive in a landscape that would have been utterly alien to anything they'd experienced in the old world. What would that look like? How would they have gotten there? And perhaps most importantly, what happened to them? First, the route. If Homo erectus reached the Americas, there are really only a few possibilities. The most obvious is Beringia, the land bridge that connected Asia to Alaska during periods of lowered sea level. During ice ages, when massive glaciers locked up huge amounts of water, sea levels dropped by hundreds of feet, exposing a broad flat plain that connected Siberia to Alaska. This is the route that modern humans almost certainly took when they first entered the Americas 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. Could Homo erectus have used the same route much earlier? Absolutely. We know erectus spread across Asia, reaching as far east as China and Indonesia. Java man, Peking man, these were all erectus populations that thrived in eastern Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. The distance from eastern Siberia to Alaska, not that far, relatively speaking. And if sea levels were low enough, it would have been a walk, not a swim. But here's the thing that makes this even more plausible. Homo erectus might have been better equipped for this journey than we give them credit for, because they weren't just land walkers. There's growing evidence that erectus had basic seafaring capabilities. Consider Flores Island in Indonesia, home of the famous hobbit, Homo floresiensis. Flores has always been an island, even during the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age. You can't walk there from the mainland. Yet hominins reached Flores at least 700,000 years ago, long before modern humans existed. The most likely candidates, Homo erectus, which means erectus figured out how to cross open ocean. Maybe on rafts, maybe on logs, maybe just by being really good swimmers, we don't know, but they did it. If erectus could cross ocean straits to reach remote islands, could they have followed coastlines, island hopping their way along the Pacific Rim, eventually reaching the Americas? It's not impossible. In fact, some researchers propose that the first Americans, even the ones we're sure about from 15,000 years ago, might have come via a coastal route rather than through the ice-free corridor inland. Picture it, small bands of Homo erectus, living along the coast, exploiting marine resources, moving slowly eastward over generations. They're not planning to reach a new continent. They don't even know it's there. They're just following food, following the shoreline, doing what humans and hominins do best, adapting, exploring, surviving, and then one day they're in Alaska. Then the Pacific Northwest, then California. The climate would have been different 130,000 years ago. This was during an interglacial period, a warm spell between ice ages. Parts of the Americas might have been quite hospitable, with abundant megafauna, rich plant resources, and relatively mild conditions. So they arrive, they spread out, at least a little. They hunt, they gather, they make tools from local stone. And for a while, maybe thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands, they survive. But then, Nothing. Fast forward to 15,000 years ago, and when the next wave of humans arrives, our species, Homo sapiens, there's no sign of any earlier hominin presence. No Erectus descendants, no hybrid populations. No remnant tools or genes. It's as if the Americas were reset, wiped clean. What happened? Here are the possibilities, and none of them are comforting. First, the population might have simply been too small to sustain itself. If only a few small groups made it across, they might have faced the classic founder effect problems: limited genetic diversity, vulnerability to disease, difficulty finding mates. Over time, isolated populations can dwindle and disappear, leaving almost no trace. Second, climate change. The period from 130,000 years ago to 15,000 years ago encompasses multiple glacial cycles, periods when ice sheets advanced and retreated, sea levels rose and fell, climates shifted dramatically. A population barely hanging on might not survive these massive environmental upheavals. Imagine your entire range getting covered by ice sheets a mile thick. Not great for long-term survival. Third, and this is the really haunting one, maybe they were still here when Homo sapiens arrived, and maybe we outcompeted them, absorbed them, or worse. After all, we have a track record: Neanderthals gone shortly after we arrived in Europe. Denisovans vanished, leaving only traces in our DNA and a handful of bone fragments. Homo floresiensis extinct. The pattern is clear. When Homo sapiens shows up, other hominin species tend to disappear. If there was a relict Homo erectus population clinging to existence in the Americas, would they have stood a chance against waves of modern humans with superior technology, larger social networks, and more sophisticated cognitive abilities? Probably not. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night. If they were here, if they lived and thrived and eventually disappeared, they deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their story told. Because the peopling of the Americas isn't just our story, it might be their story too. And that brings us to the central question: did they actually make it? Is the Cerutti site real evidence of Homo erectus in the Americas, or is it an archaeological mirage, a pattern we desperately want to see in ambiguous data? To answer that, we need to understand who Homo erectus really was, what they were capable of, and whether the journey to the Americas was even remotely possible for a species that most people think of as primitive, brutish, barely human. Spoiler alert, Homo erectus was none of those things. Here's a question that should humble every single one of us: which human species was the most successful? If you answered Homo sapiens, you'd be wrong. At least you'd be wrong if we're measuring success by longevity. Because Homo erectus, our ancient, often underestimated cousin, lasted nearly 2 million years. 2 million years. Let that sink in for a moment. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens has been around for maybe 300,000 years. Civilization? About 10,000 years. The Roman Empire lasted 5 centuries and we're still impressed. But Homo erectus, they were the biological equivalent of the Rolling Stones. They just kept going and going and going. Erectus first appeared in Africa around 1.9 million years ago, and they didn't go extinct until possibly as recently as 110,000 years ago, though some isolated populations might have persisted even longer. That's an incomprehensible span of time. Entire continents shifted. Ice ages came and went. Species rose and fell, and through it all, Erectus endured. So who were they, really? Let's start with the basics. Homo erectus was the first hominin that genuinely looked human from a distance. They stood upright, hence the name, with a body plan remarkably similar to ours. They were tall, often between 5 and 6 feet. They had long legs adapted for walking and running across open landscapes. Their arms were shorter, relative to their legs, than earlier hominins, meaning they'd fully committed to life on the ground rather than in trees. But the real magic was happening above the neck. Erectus had a brain significantly larger than their predecessors, averaging around 900 cubic centimeters compared to about 600 for earlier Australopithecines. Now, that's still smaller than our modern 1350 cubic centimeters, but here's the thing, brain size isn't everything. What matters is organization, connectivity, and what you do with it. And what Erectus did with their brains was extraordinary. They were the first hominins to master fire. Think about that. Fire, the ultimate game changer. With fire you can cook food, making it easier to digest and extracting more calories and nutrients. With fire you can keep warm, extending your range into colder climates. With fire you can keep predators at bay, light the darkness, and create a social center where your group gathers, bonds, and shares knowledge. The earliest definitive evidence of controlled fire use comes from Erectus sites dating back at least 400,000 years, possibly much earlier. Some controversial sites in South Africa suggest fire use as far back as 1,000,000 years ago. Whether those early dates hold up or not, one thing is clear. Erectus figured out fire long before we did, and they used it to transform their world. Then there are the tools. Erectus is famous for creating the Acheulean toolkit, those beautiful teardrop-shaped hand axes that are so iconic they belong in museums and on book covers. These weren't crude chunks of bashed rock. These were carefully planned, symmetrical tools that required forethought, skill, and an understanding of stone fracture mechanics. You had to envision the finished tool inside the raw stone and then work methodically to bring it into being. Some researchers argue that making Acheulean hand axes required a level of cognitive sophistication we typically associate only with modern humans, the ability to hold a mental template, to plan sequences of actions, to teach others through demonstration. Erectus groups passed down these tool-making traditions across thousands of generations, creating what might be the longest-lasting cultural tradition in all of human history. But here's what really sets Erectus apart. They went everywhere. They didn't just stay in Africa, comfortable in the environment where they evolved. No, they spread across the Middle East into Europe, across Southern Asia to China, southeast into Indonesia. They adapted to tropical rainforests and temperate woodlands and semi-arid grasslands. They faced down predators we can barely imagine, giant hyenas, saber-toothed cats, massive crocodiles. The most famous Erectus populations have names you've probably heard. Java man, discovered in Indonesia in the 1890s. Peking man, found in China in the 1920s. Turkana boy, the incredibly complete skeleton of an adolescent Erectus discovered in Kenya. Each of these finds told us something new about Erectus, building a picture of a species that was tough, adaptable, and relentlessly curious. And they weren't just wandering randomly. Erectus populations showed clear evidence of living in social groups, cooperating to hunt and gather, caring for injured and elderly members. There's a famous Erectus skeleton from Dmanisi, Georgia, an older individual who had lost most of their teeth years before death. Without teeth, they couldn't process tough food. Someone had to help them, feeding them softer foods, keeping them alive. That's compassion, that's society. So when we ask whether Homo erectus could have reached the Americas, we're not talking about some shambling, primitive ape men. We're talking about sophisticated, tool-using, fire-mastering, ocean-crossing survivors who dominated the old world for nearly 2 million years. We're talking about the pioneers who proved that hominins could live anywhere, survive anything, and adapt to whatever challenges the world threw at them. The question isn't whether they were capable of reaching the Americas. The question is whether they had the opportunity and the motivation. And to answer that, we need to look at their track record of long-distance migrations and their ability to overcome barriers that should have been insurmountable. Let's talk about something that should be impossible. According to traditional thinking, Homo erectus, and indeed any hominin before modern Homo sapiens, couldn't cross significant water barriers. They didn't have boats. They didn't have the cognitive sophistication to plan and execute ocean voyages. They were land animals, period. Except they absolutely crossed open ocean, multiple times. And we have proof. The most stunning evidence comes from the island of Flores in Indonesia. Flores is a small island in the Lesser Sunda chain, and it's been a biogeographical puzzle for decades because of what we found there, Homo floresiensis, the famous hobbit. These were tiny hominins, standing only about 3.5 feet tall, with brains the size of grapefruits, who lived on Flores until at least 50,000 years ago. But here's the kicker: Flores has always been an island. Even during the absolute lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, when massive ice sheets locked up so much water that ocean levels dropped by 400 feet, Flores remained separated from the mainland by deep ocean straits. The Wallace Line, a major biogeographical boundary, runs between Bali and Lombok, and it represents a water barrier that very few land animals ever crossed naturally. Yet hominins reached Flores at least 700,000 years ago. We know this because we found stone tools dating back that far. Homo floresiensis itself probably evolved from an earlier Erectus population that somehow made it to the island and then underwent insular dwarfism, shrinking over hundreds of thousands of years of isolation. So how did Erectus reach Flores? They couldn't have walked, the water was too deep. They couldn't have swum, the currents are treacherous and the distance too far. The only logical conclusion is that they crossed deliberately, using some form of watercraft. Maybe rafts lashed together from bamboo, maybe large logs they could cling to while kicking. Maybe they were just really good at using flotsam and natural debris to assist water crossings. We don't know the specifics, but we know it happened. And not just once. Genetic evidence suggests multiple waves of hominin migration to various Indonesian islands over hundreds of thousands of years. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional exploration, or at least intentional movement along coastlines that required repeated water crossings, and Flores isn't the only example. Stone tools have been found on other islands in the region, Sulawesi, Luzon in the Philippines, all of which required water crossings to reach. Some researchers now believe that Erectus populations habitually lived along coastlines, exploiting marine resources and becoming comfortable with water in ways we never imagined. There's growing evidence that Erectus ate fish and shellfish. Coastal sites in Africa and Asia have yielded fish bones with cut marks, shells that show signs of being deliberately opened, and even possible fish hooks. If you're living on the coast, eating from the ocean, you're going to become intimately familiar with tides, currents, and water. You're going to experiment with floating on logs, building simple rafts, maybe even fishing from shallow waters. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this coastal adaptation could have taken Erectus populations incredible distances. Follow the coastline from Africa around the Arabian Peninsula, along the shores of India, through Southeast Asia, and you eventually reach the Pacific. From there, it's a hop to Japan, another hop to the Kamchatka Peninsula, and suddenly you're looking across the Bering Strait at Alaska. Is this speculative? Absolutely, but it's not wild speculation. It's speculation grounded in evidence of Erectus's seafaring capabilities and their demonstrated ability to live in coastal environments. And if we're trying to figure out whether Erectus could have reached the Americas, the coastal route is by far the most plausible pathway. Here's another fascinating piece of the puzzle: timing. The Cerutti Mastodon site is dated to 130,000 years ago. That's during an interglacial period, a warm spell between ice ages. During interglacials, sea levels were high, often higher than today. That might seem like a problem for the Beringia land bridge theory. If sea levels were high, there's no land bridge to walk across. But high sea levels actually favor the coastal migration theory. With more exposed coastline, more shallow marine environments, and milder temperatures, coastal routes become incredibly attractive. And if Erectus populations were already adapted to coastal living, an interglacial period might have been the perfect time for them to spread along the Pacific Rim. Think of it as a slow-motion expansion over thousands of years. One generation moves a few miles up the coast. The next generation pushes a little farther. There's no grand plan, No deliberate migration, just people following food, exploring new territories, doing what humans have always done. And eventually, improbably, some of them end up in the Americas. Now, I know what you're thinking. If this happened, why isn't there more evidence? Why don't we have Erectus fossils scattered along the Pacific coastline, creating a trail of breadcrumbs we can follow? The answer is both simple and frustrating. The sea ate the evidence. During the last ice age, sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. That means the coastlines where Erectus might have lived and traveled are now underwater, drowned beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. Any campsites, any tools, any fossil remains. They're on the ocean floor, buried under sediment and coral, completely inaccessible to archaeologists. We face the same problem trying to trace the route of the first Homo sapiens who entered the Americas. If they came via a coastal route, and many researchers believe they did, most of the evidence is now submerged. We're trying to reconstruct ancient migrations with only a fraction of the landscape available to study, but every so often something survives. A site that's high enough, old enough, unusual enough to escape the ravages of time and rising seas, something like Cerutti. All right, let's put this all together. We've established that Homo erectus was smart, adaptable, and capable of crossing open water. They lived along coastlines, exploited marine resources, and spread across the entire Old World. The question now is, did they have everything necessary to make it to the Americas? Let's break this down into three components: skills, motivation, and opportunity. Skills. We've already covered this extensively, but let's recap. Erectus had fire, which meant they could survive in diverse climates, cook food, and create warm, safe campsites. They had sophisticated stone tools, including hand axes and flake tools that could be used for butchering animals, processing plants, and crafting other tools from wood and bone. They had the physical endurance for long-distance travel. Erectus was built for walking, with a body plan optimized for efficiency over vast distances. Studies of Erectus skeletons suggest they were incredibly robust, with thick bones and powerful muscles. These weren't delicate creatures, they were built to last. And they had the cognitive capacity for planning and problem-solving. Making Acheulean hand axes requires understanding cause and effect, planning sequences of actions, and learning from mistakes. Living in social groups requires communication, cooperation, and the ability to teach younger members. Crossing water requires assessing risks, preparing resources, and executing a plan. Could Erectus navigate by the stars? We don't know. Could they construct complex watercraft? Probably not at the level of later humans, but simple rafts. Quite possibly. Did they have language? That's hotly debated, but they certainly had some form of communication sophisticated enough to coordinate hunts, share knowledge, and maintain group cohesion. Bottom line, Erectus had the skills. Check. Motivation. This one's tricky because we're not talking about conscious, deliberate migration like, hey, let's go find America. We're talking about the same forces that drive all animal migrations: following food, seeking better resources, population pressure, curiosity. Imagine an Erectus group living on the coast of northern Asia. Resources are scarce, maybe there's been a harsh winter, or game is depleted, or a rival group has pushed them out of prime territory. What do? You move. You follow the coastline, looking for shellfish beds, seal colonies, places where rivers meet the ocean and fish are abundant. Over generations, this movement adds up. And if you're following a coastline that happens to lead toward Beringia, eventually you end up in a new world. There doesn't need to be grand motivation. Just the same survival instincts that had driven Erectus across Africa and Asia for millions of years. But there might have been another factor: curiosity. We tend to think of curiosity as a uniquely human trait, but it's actually quite common in intelligent animals. Primates explore, they investigate new objects, new territories, new possibilities. If Erectus spotted land across the water, whether across the Bering Strait or along island chains, some individuals might have simply wanted to know what was over there. Never underestimate the power of, "I wonder what's on the other side of that hill." It's driven every human migration, every exploration, every discovery in our history. And if Erectus had even a fraction of that drive, it might have been enough. Now this is where things get really interesting, because opportunity is all about timing. When could Erectus have made it to the Americas, and were conditions right? The most obvious window is during glacial periods when sea levels were low and Beringia was exposed. This happened multiple times over the past million years. During these periods, you could literally walk from Siberia to Alaska. No boats required. Erectus populations in Eastern Asia were well positioned to take advantage of this route. But there's a problem: glaciation. During ice ages, massive ice sheets covered much of northern North America. Even if Erectus made it across Beringia, they might have encountered an impenetrable wall of ice. The ice-free corridor, the pathway between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets that later humans probably used, didn't exist during all glacial periods. Sometimes it was completely blocked. This brings us back to the coastal route. If Erectus stayed along the coast, following the Pacific shoreline south, they could potentially bypass the ice sheets entirely. The coast might have remained ice-free even during glacial maxima, providing a corridor along the western edge of North America. And during interglacial periods, like 130,000 years ago, when the Cerutti Mastodon lived, sea levels were high, but climates were mild. Ice sheets had retreated. The Americas would have been relatively hospitable, with abundant megafauna and diverse plant resources. If Erectus populations were already coastal adapted, an interglacial might have been the perfect time for island hopping and coastal migration to carry them across the Pacific and into the New World. So yes, there were opportunities, multiple opportunities. In fact, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, and Erectus was around for all of them. Here's the thing that really gets me. We know Erectus was in China 780,000 years ago. We know they were in Indonesia 700,000 years ago. We know they survived in these regions until at least 110,000 years ago, possibly later. That's 750,000 years of opportunity for some adventurous band of Erectus to push just a bit farther east, to cross just one more strait, to follow the coastline just a bit longer. Would it have taken extraordinary luck? Yes. Would it have required favorable conditions, the right population at the right time, in the right place? Absolutely. But extraordinary doesn't mean impossible, and over the vast timescales we're discussing, hundreds of thousands of years, even low-probability events become not just possible but likely. So could Homo erectus have reached the Americas, based on their skills, their demonstrated seafaring capabilities, their adaptability, and the multiple windows of opportunity spanning hundreds of millennia? The answer is yes, they absolutely could. The question is whether they actually did, and to answer that, we need to look at the evidence, all of it, the sites that support the idea, the glaring gaps that argue against it, and the scientific process of how we even begin to evaluate claims this extraordinary. The Cerutti Mastodon isn't alone in its loneliness. There's a whole constellation of controversial archaeological sites scattered across the Americas, each claiming evidence of human presence long before the accepted timeline. Some are more credible than others. Some have been debunked, and some remain tantalizingly ambiguous, sitting in that uncomfortable zone where the evidence isn't quite strong enough to convince everyone, but isn't quite weak enough to dismiss entirely. Let's take a tour of pre-Clovis America, because understanding this landscape is crucial to evaluating whether Homo erectus could have been here. First stop, Monteverde, Chile. This is the gold standard of pre-Clovis sites, and it's the one that finally forced the archaeological establishment to admit that maybe, just maybe, the Clovis first model was wrong. Monteverde is dated to about 14,500 years ago, not nearly as old as Cerutti, but old enough to predate Clovis culture by over 1,000 years. What makes Monteverde so convincing? Everything you want to see at an archaeological site. Clear evidence of human habitation, including tent-like structures, a wide variety of stone tools, wooden tools preserved in peat, hearths with burned food remains, and even medicinal plants that must have been deliberately collected and transported. It's an archaeological slam dunk. Monteverde proved that people were in South America before Clovis culture emerged in North America, which meant the traditional model that Clovis people were the first Americans who entered through an ice-free corridor 13,000 years ago was fundamentally wrong. If people were in Chile 14,500 years ago, they must have entered the Americas earlier and traveled south, possibly along the Pacific coast. Monteverde opened the floodgates. Suddenly, other pre-Clovis sites that had been dismissed or ignored got a second look. Sites like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, which has dates going back possibly 19,000 years. Like Cactus Hill in Virginia, with dates around 18,000 years. Like the Bluefish Caves in Canada, where cut-marked bones might date to 24,000 years ago. Each of these sites has its defenders and its critics. The debates get technical arguments about radiocarbon dating methodology, about whether bones were really cut by humans or by carnivores, about whether stone flakes are tools or just natural break patterns. But collectively they suggest that humans were in the Americas earlier than 13,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. Now, even if we accept all of these sites, and that's a big if, we're still talking about anatomically modern Homo sapiens arriving between 15,000 and 25,000 years ago. That's nowhere near the 130,000-year mark of Cerutti, but there are whispers of something older, much older. The Topper site in South Carolina has yielded what archaeologist Albert Goodyear claims are stone tools from a layer dated to about 50,000 years ago, well below the accepted Clovis layers. The artifacts are crude, just simple flakes and cores, but Goodyear argues they show clear signs of intentional production. Critics say they're geofacts, naturally fractured stones that only look like tools. Pedra Furada in Brazil is even more controversial. This rock shelter contains cave paintings and what some researchers claim are artifacts and hearths, dating back over 30,000 years, possibly even 50,000 years. The site has been fought over for decades. Some researchers see clear evidence of human occupation. Others see natural rockfalls and wildfire remnants that have been misinterpreted. Then there's the Calico Hills site in California, excavated in the 1960s and championed by none other than Louis Leakey, the famous paleoanthropologist. Leakey claimed the site contained tools dating to 200,000 years ago. The scientific community overwhelmingly rejected this interpretation, seeing only natural geology, not human artifacts. The site became a cautionary tale about seeing what you want to see. Do you see the pattern here? The further back in time you go, the more controversial the sites become. And the more controversial the sites, the more the evidence tends to be ambiguous. Broken rocks that might be tools, broken bones that might have been smashed by humans, fire-cracked rocks that might be from hearths. This is the fundamental challenge. Ancient sites are messy. Natural processes can mimic human activity. Stone can fracture from freeze-thaw cycles, from geological pressure, from nothing more than gravity and time. Bones can break from trampling, from scavenger activity, from sediment pressure. Fires can start from lightning strikes. When you're dealing with sites tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years old, you're often working with minimal evidence that's been degraded, displaced, and disturbed. It's like trying to reconstruct a movie from 3 seconds of damaged film. You can see shapes, movements, patterns, but is it enough to know what really happened? This is why Cerutti is so controversial. The evidence is exactly the type that's hardest to evaluate. Broken bones, a handful of rocks, nothing else. No hearths, no tools, no fossils. If you found this exact same evidence at a 15,000-year-old site, it might raise eyebrows, but it wouldn't be revolutionary. But 130,000 years ago, that's in a completely different category. And yet, what if there was a way to find more direct evidence? What if instead of arguing about whether rocks are tools and bones are butchered, we could find the hominins themselves? Here's the elephant in the room, or rather the absence of the elephant in the room. If Homo erectus populations lived in the Americas for tens of thousands of years, where are their fossils? Where are their bones? This is the skeptic's strongest argument, and it's a good one. We have erectus fossils from all over the Old World: Africa, Asia, Europe. Hundreds of specimens representing dozens of sites. Some are fragmentary, a tooth here, a piece of skull there, but some are remarkably complete, like Turkana Boy or the Dmanisi skulls. If Erectus was in the Americas, why haven't we found even a single tooth? The answer might be simpler than you think. We're really bad at finding fossils. Consider this: the entire fossil record of human evolution. Every hominin fossil ever discovered from the past 7 million years would fit in the back of a pickup truck. We're talking about millions of years of evolutionary history, billions of individual hominins who lived and died, and we have maybe a few thousand fragmentary fossils to represent all of them. Fossilization is rare. Most organisms don't fossilize. They decay, get scavenged, get destroyed by geological processes. You need very specific conditions: rapid burial, minimal oxygen, the right mineral environment. And even if something does fossilize, it still needs to survive millions of years of erosion, tectonic activity, and other destructive forces. Then, after all that, someone has to find it. In the Americas, we face additional challenges. Much of the landscape has been dramatically altered by glaciation, flooding, volcanic activity, and human development. The coastlines where Erectus might have lived are now underwater. The forests where they might have died are now covered by cities. The caves where their bones might have rested have been scoured by ice or filled with sediment. And here's the really frustrating part: we don't have great fossil records for any hominins in the Americas, even the ones we know were here. How many Clovis-era human fossils have we found? A handful. How many from the pre-Clovis period? You can count them on one hand. Kennewick Man, Arlington Springs woman, a few others. That's basically it for the entire peopling of the Americas until just a few thousand years ago. If we barely have fossils from 15,000 years ago, why would we expect to find fossils from 130,000 years ago? But there's another way to look for ancient human presence: genetics. When modern humans spread across the globe, we encountered other hominin species, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, and we didn't just compete with them, we interbred with them. If you're of European descent, you carry roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA. If you're of Asian or Oceanic descent, you might carry Denisovan DNA as well. These genetic signatures tell us that when different human species met, they sometimes formed relationships and had children. Those hybrid offspring left descendants, and those descendants are us. So here's the fascinating question. If Homo erectus was in the Americas, and if they survived long enough to encounter the first Homo sapiens who arrived 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, might we carry Erectus DNA? Could there be a ghost lineage hiding in Native American genomes, a whisper of an earlier human species? Geneticists have looked. They've sequenced genomes of indigenous peoples from across the Americas, looking for signs of archaic admixture, and so far, nothing. No clear signal of non-sapiens DNA. No mysterious genetic component that can't be explained by modern human variation. But, and this is a big but, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Genetic signals degrade over time. If Erectus populations were small, isolated, and died out tens of thousands of years before sapiens arrived, there might simply be no overlap. Or if there was interbreeding, but the hybrid lineages didn't survive, the genetic signature could have been lost. There's also the possibility that we're not looking in the right way. Denisovan DNA was only identified because we had an actual Denisovan fossil to sequence and compare against modern genomes. If we don't have Erectus fossils from the Americas, we might not recognize an Erectus genetic signature even if it's there. Some researchers have pointed to unusual genetic markers in certain Native American populations, lineages that seem older than expected, mitochondrial haplogroups that don't fit neat patterns. Most of these anomalies have been explained by quirks of population history, founder effects, and ancient admixture within Homo sapiens. But a few remain puzzling. I'm not saying these are evidence of Erectus. I'm saying the genetic picture is complicated and we might not have all the pieces yet. Then there's the megafauna mystery. When humans arrived in the Americas around 13,000 years ago, something catastrophic happened. The megafauna disappeared. Within just a few thousand years, camels, horses, ground sloths, mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats all gone. Dozens of species wiped out. The leading theory is that human hunting, combined with climate change, drove these extinctions. Humans were efficient predators with sophisticated weapons, and the megafauna had no evolutionary experience with human hunting strategies. They were sitting ducks. But here's the weird thing. If Homo erectus had been in the Americas for tens of thousands of years before sapiens arrived, the megafauna would have had plenty of time to adapt to hominin predation. They wouldn't be naive. They'd be wary, aggressive, hard to hunt, like African megafauna that evolved alongside humans. Yet the American megafauna seemed to have been completely unprepared for human hunters. They behaved like animals that had never encountered hominins before, which suggests maybe they hadn't. This isn't proof that Erectus wasn't here, but it's suggestive. It hints that if Erectus did reach the Americas, they might have been rare, marginal, and ecologically insignificant, not a persistent population that would have shaped the evolution and behavior of other species. Let's step back from the bones and stones for a moment and ask a deeper question. Why does this matter? Why do we care whether Homo erectus reached the Americas? On one level, it's just about getting history right. We want to know what actually happened. We want to understand the true story of how the Americas were peopled, when it happened, who was involved. That's the fundamental drive of science, to replace ignorance with knowledge, speculation with evidence. But on another level, this question touches something profound about how we understand ourselves and our place in the story of life on Earth. For most of human history, we've told ourselves comforting stories about being special. We're the pinnacle of creation, the inevitable endpoint of evolution, the species that was always destined to inherit the Earth. And in many tellings of human history, the Americas represented the final frontier, the last unpeopled continents, waiting pristine and empty for modern humans to discover and inhabit. But what if that story is wrong? What if the Americas weren't empty? What if other human species got here first, lived here, thrived here, and then vanished, leaving barely a trace? That changes everything. It means our story isn't one of triumphant firsts. We're the cleanup crew, the species that arrived after others had already explored these continents. It means Homo sapiens isn't uniquely special in our wanderlust and adaptability. Erectus did it first. They proved it could be done. And maybe that's exactly the perspective we need right now. Because the story of Homo erectus, whether they reach the Americas or not, is ultimately a story about resilience, adaptation, and the raw drive to explore and survive that characterizes the entire human lineage, not just our species. Think about it. Erectus survived for nearly 2 million years. They weathered countless climate shifts, from warm interglacials to brutal glacial periods. They faced predators that would give us nightmares. They lived without agriculture, without writing, without any of the technologies we consider essential to civilization, and they thrived. What made them successful? Adaptability, cooperation, intelligence, the same traits that define us. Because here's the truth that paleoanthropology keeps teaching us: we're not special. We're just the latest iteration of a process that's been going on for millions of years. Every human species, Erectus, Heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, Denisovans, us, represents evolution's ongoing experiment with intelligence, culture, and adaptability. We're all branches on the same tree, all working out different solutions to the same problems. How to find food, how to stay safe, how to raise children, how to work together to survive in a dangerous world. And when you understand that, the question of whether Erectus reached the Americas becomes less about winning some evolutionary competition and more about recognizing the full scope of the human story. If Erectus made it here, it expands that story. It makes the saga of human migration even more epic, even more improbable, even more inspiring. But let's be honest, we probably won't know the answer anytime soon. The Cerutti site remains controversial. The evidence is ambiguous. The skeptics have valid points, and so do the defenders. Short of finding an actual Erectus skeleton in California or uncovering a site with undeniable tools and clear stratigraphy, we're stuck in uncertainty. And you know what? That's okay. Science isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking better questions and being willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if that means living with uncertainty. The debate over Cerutti and the possibility of Erectus in the Americas is doing exactly what scientific debates should do. It's forcing us to examine our assumptions, to develop better methods for evaluating evidence, to think creatively about what's possible. It's pushing archaeologists to be more careful about how they interpret broken bones and rocks, which will make the field stronger. It's inspiring researchers to look for new sites, to check old museum collections, to use new technologies like ancient DNA analysis and advanced dating techniques. It's reminding us that the past is far stranger and more complex than we often imagine. And it's teaching us humility. Every generation of scientists thinks they've figured out the human story. Every generation is proven wrong by new discoveries. 50 years ago, we were certain humans arrived in the Americas 13,000 years ago. Now we're pretty sure it was at least 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, maybe earlier. What will we be certain of 50 years from now? I don't know. But I guarantee it'll be different from what we think today. So whether Homo erectus reached the Americas or not, this mystery is valuable. It keeps us curious. It keeps us humble. It reminds us that there are still profound questions about our own history that remain unanswered. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. The story of humanity isn't finished. We're still discovering who we are, where we came from, and what we're capable of. Every fossil, every stone tool, every controversial site adds another piece to an enormous puzzle. Sometimes the pieces fit together clearly, sometimes they don't fit at all. And sometimes, like with Cerutti, we're not sure if we're holding a piece of the puzzle or just a random fragment that doesn't belong to any picture. But we keep looking, we keep digging. We keep asking questions because that's what humans do. That's what we've always done, whether we're Homo sapiens in the 21st century or Homo erectus standing on a beach a million years ago, looking out at the ocean and wondering what's on the other side. The mystery of whether Homo erectus reached the Americas is really a mirror, reflecting back our own restless curiosity, our drive to explore, our need to know. And in that sense, the question isn't just about them, it's about us. It's about what it means to be human. So where do we go from here? We're stuck with a tantalizing mystery, ambiguous evidence and passionate arguments on both sides. But science doesn't just throw up its hands and quit when faced with uncertainty. Science gets creative. Science develops new tools, new methods, new ways of asking old questions. And right now, we're living through a revolution in how we study the deep past. Technologies that didn't exist even 20 years ago are giving us unprecedented power to extract information from ancient sites, ancient bones, and even ancient dirt. Let me walk you through some of the most exciting developments that might finally crack the mystery of whether Homo erectus or any other pre-sapiens hominin reached the Americas. Let's start with the big one: ancient DNA, or a DNA. This technology has completely transformed our understanding of human evolution over the past decade. We've sequenced Neanderthal genomes. We've discovered entirely new human species, like the Denisovans, from nothing more than a finger bone and a few teeth. We've tracked ancient migrations, identified interbreeding events, and rewritten family trees that were considered settled science. The technical challenges are enormous. DNA degrades over time, breaking down into smaller and smaller fragments. Heat accelerates degradation, which is why most successful DNA studies come from cold climates: Siberia, Northern Europe, high-altitude caves. Anything older than about 400,000 years is generally considered beyond the reach of current DNA technology, though researchers keep pushing that boundary. Now, here's the problem for our Homo erectus question. We don't have any erectus remains from the Americas to test, but that doesn't mean a DNA can't help us. Because there's another approach that's gaining traction: environmental DNA or eDNA. Imagine this: organisms are constantly shedding DNA into their environment. Skin cells, hair, bodily fluids, decomposing tissue, all of it leaves behind genetic traces in the soil, in sediment, in cave deposits. That DNA can persist for thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years. Scientists have already used eDNA to identify species that lived in ancient caves, even when there are no bones or fossils present. Could we use eDNA to look for hominin traces at sites like Cerutti? Theoretically, yes. The technology is still developing, and working with samples 130,000 years old would be pushing the absolute limits of what's possible, but it's not impossible. If Erectus was at that site butchering that mastodon, they would have left DNA behind. Finding it would be like looking for a needle in a haystack, the size of Texas. But with the right techniques, the right preservation conditions, and frankly a lot of luck, it might just work. Even if we can't find Erectus DNA directly, we can search for it indirectly in modern populations. Advanced genomic techniques are getting better at identifying archaic admixture, the genetic signatures of interbreeding between modern humans and other hominin species. We found Neanderthal DNA in modern Europeans this way. We found Denisovan DNA in modern Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians. Could there be an Erectus signature hiding in Native American genomes? Most geneticists say no, they've looked, and the data doesn't support it. But most isn't all, and the analysis methods keep improving. We might be able to detect fainter signals, older admixture events, or patterns that previous techniques missed. It's a long shot, but it's worth pursuing. Advanced dating techniques, pinning down time. One of the biggest sources of controversy around sites like Cerutti is dating. How do we know the mastodon bones are really 130,000 years old? How do we know the stone tools at Topper are 50,000 years old? How do we know anything about the age of these controversial sites? Dating ancient materials is both an art and a science, and it's gotten dramatically better in recent years. Radiocarbon dating, the workhorse of archaeology, only works on organic materials less than about 50,000 years old. Beyond that, there's simply not enough carbon-14 left to measure accurately. So for older sites we need other methods. Uranium-thorium dating, which was used at Cerutti, works on bones and can reach back hundreds of thousands of years. It measures the decay of uranium isotopes into thorium, giving you an age for when the bone stopped exchanging materials with its environment, basically when it got buried. The technique is solid, but it requires pristine preservation and careful interpretation. Optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL, dates the last time sediment grains were exposed to sunlight. It's incredibly useful for dating the layers that artifacts are found in, even when the artifacts themselves can't be dated directly. Improvements in OSL are allowing us to date older sites with greater precision. But here's the exciting development. Researchers are now combining multiple dating techniques on single sites, cross-referencing results to build a more robust chronology. If uranium-thorium dating, OSL, and paleomagnetic analysis all point to the same age range, you can be much more confident in your dates. There are also emerging techniques like cosmogenic nuclide dating, which measures the buildup of rare isotopes created by cosmic ray bombardment. This can date stone surfaces and artifacts directly, potentially giving us ages for the tools themselves rather than just the layers they're found in. The point is, we're getting better at this. Sites that were dated decades ago using crude methods can be redated with modern techniques, giving us much more reliable chronologies. And that matters enormously when you're trying to determine whether something is 13,000 or 130,000 years old. One of the challenges at sites like Cerutti is distinguishing human activity from natural processes. How do you prove that a bone was broken by a human rather than by geological pressure? How do you prove that a stone was used as a tool rather than just being a rock that nature happened to bang around? Enter modern imaging and analysis techniques. Micro-CT scanning allows researchers to examine bone fractures at microscopic resolution, looking for telltale patterns that distinguish human-caused breaks from natural ones. You can see impact points, crack propagation patterns, even microscopic traces of stone contact on bone surfaces. Residue analysis is another game changer. Using techniques like mass spectrometry and protein analysis, scientists can identify microscopic traces of blood, fat, plant materials, and other organic residues on stone tools. If you find Mastodon blood proteins on a rock from Cerutti, that's pretty compelling evidence that the rock was used to process Mastodon remains. Use-wear analysis has also become incredibly sophisticated. When you use a stone tool, it leaves microscopic polishes, striations, and edge damage that vary depending on what you're cutting: meat, hide, wood, bone. Under high-powered microscopes, trained analysts can identify these use-wear patterns and determine what a tool was used for, even on artifacts tens of thousands of years old. There's also isotopic analysis of bone chemistry, which can tell us about diet, migration patterns, and environmental conditions. If we ever found an actual Erectus skeleton in the Americas, isotopic analysis could tell us whether they grew up locally or migrated from elsewhere, what they ate, and what kind of climate they lived in. Here's one that sounds like science fiction, but is already bearing fruit, using AI to identify archaeological sites and artifacts. Machine learning algorithms can be trained to recognize patterns in satellite imagery that indicate potential archaeological sites, subtle changes in vegetation, soil composition, or landscape features that might indicate human occupation. Researchers are using these techniques to identify new sites in remote or understudied areas. What if there are Erectus sites in the Americas, but they're in places we haven't looked yet? What if they're buried under jungles, deserts, or modern cities, invisible to traditional survey methods, but detectable to trained algorithms analyzing satellite data? AI is also being used to analyze artifacts. You can train neural networks to distinguish stone tools from naturally fractured rocks, to identify specific knapping techniques, to recognize patterns that human observers might miss. This could help resolve debates about controversial sites where the evidence is ambiguous. Imagine feeding an AI system thousands of examples of known stone tools and known natural rocks, then asking it to evaluate the stones from Cerutti. Would it classify them as tools or geofacts? We're not there yet, but we're getting close. Remember when I mentioned that ancient coastlines are now underwater? That's one of the biggest obstacles to finding evidence of early human migrations. But it's not an insurmountable obstacle anymore. Underwater archaeology has advanced dramatically in recent years. Remote-operated vehicles equipped with high-resolution sonar can map underwater landscapes in incredible detail. Submarines and diving teams can excavate underwater sites that would have been coastal zones during the Ice Age. There have already been some stunning discoveries. Off the coast of Florida, divers found a 14,500-year-old burial site submerged in a sinkhole. In the North Sea, fishermen regularly dredge up stone tools and mammoth bones from what was once Doggerland, a vast plain that connected Britain to continental Europe during the Ice Age. What if similar sites exist off the Pacific coast of the Americas? What if there are Erectus campsites, tool scatters, or fossil remains sitting on the ocean floor, preserved under sediment, waiting to be discovered. It's expensive, technically challenging, and covers an enormous area. But with advancing technology and targeted survey strategies, underwater archaeology might finally let us explore the coastal migration routes that could have brought Erectus or early sapiens to the Americas. Here's a democratizing trend. More and more archaeological research is involving non-professionals. Citizen scientists can help analyze satellite imagery, looking for potential archaeological sites. They can help classify artifacts in museum collections. They can report finds from their own backyards that might lead to significant discoveries. There are also initiatives to digitize archaeological collections, making decades of excavated materials available for reanalysis. Stones and bones sitting in museum basements, collected 50 or 100 years ago and never fully studied, are being photographed, scanned and uploaded to databases where researchers worldwide can examine them. What if evidence of Erectus in the Americas is already sitting in a museum storage room somewhere, misidentified or overlooked? What if an amateur fossil hunter in California stumbles across something extraordinary on a weekend hike? The more eyes looking, the more likely we are to find answers. All of these technologies, all of these methods point toward a future where we can answer questions that seem impossible today. We'll be able to extract more information from less material. We'll be able to explore environments that are currently inaccessible. We'll be able to see patterns in data that human minds alone couldn't recognize. Does this mean we'll definitively prove or disprove Erectus in the Americas? Maybe, maybe not. But we'll get closer to the truth, whatever it is. And here's what really excites me. We don't even know what questions we'll be able to ask in 20 years. 20 years ago, ancient DNA was in its infancy. The human genome had just been sequenced. The idea of recovering Neanderthal DNA seemed like fantasy. Now it's routine. What will be routine 20 years from now? What techniques that currently seem impossible will be standard procedure? What mysteries that seem unsolvable today will have clear answers? The past isn't static. It's constantly being rewritten as we develop better tools to read it. And the story of whether Homo erectus reached the Americas is still being written. Every new technique, every new discovery, every controversial site adds another paragraph. The chapter isn't closed. In many ways, it's just beginning. And the most exciting discoveries might still be ahead of us, waiting in the sediment, waiting in the data, waiting for someone with the right tools and the right questions to bring them to light. That's the beauty of science. That's the thrill of archaeology. We're detectives investigating the greatest mystery ever: who we are, where we came from, and what our ancestors were capable of. So, did Homo erectus reach the Americas? Honestly, we don't know. The evidence at Cerutti is tantalizing but not conclusive. The capability was certainly there. Erectus had the skills, the adaptability, the demonstrated ability to cross water barriers and colonize new territories. The opportunity existed across hundreds of thousands of years, multiple windows when climate and geography aligned. But without fossils, without unambiguous tools, without genetic signatures, we can't say for certain. What we can say is this: the question itself has changed how we think about human migration, about the capabilities of our ancient relatives, and about the complexity of the past. Whether Erectus walked on American soil or not, their legacy is undeniable. They pioneered the migrations that all subsequent humans would follow. They proved that hominins could master fire, create sophisticated tools, cross oceans, and adapt to nearly any environment. They showed that intelligence, cooperation, and resilience weren't unique to Homo sapiens. They were part of being human long before our species existed. And maybe, somewhere in the hills of California or along a now submerged coastline, evidence waits to be discovered: a skeleton, a tool cache, something that will finally answer the question. Or maybe the evidence was lost to time, claimed by rising seas and grinding glaciers, and we'll never know for sure. Either way, the search continues, because that's what we do. That's what makes us human. If this story made you think differently about human origins, about what's possible, about the vast sweep of time and the species that came before us, consider subscribing. There are more mysteries out there, more questions that challenge what we think we know about ourselves and our past. And I'll be here digging into them one story at a time. Thanks for joining me on this journey into deep time. Until next time, keep questioning, keep wondering, and keep looking at those stones and bones a little differently. You never know what stories they might tell.